In this session, we are going to talk about how to write the introduction chapter of a research thesis or how to write the introduction section of a research paper. What are the critical ingredients of the introduction chapter of a research thesis and how it differs from a research paper. The introduction chapter. We start with the chapter overview, giving a brief introduction of what this chapter does. And we do this for all the different chapters of a research thesis. We do provide a chapter overview. Following this, you start with the background of the study. And the background actually involves writing about two important things. First, the value or importance of your research area or the topic in general. So you start by identifying why this particular topic needs to be studied. Why is this topic important? What is the necessity that revolves around this topic? And if you are focusing on any specific study setting, this is followed by value of your topic in the field or the study setting. You highlight why is there a need to study the concept in this particular setting. When you're writing a thesis, both these things have to be in much detail. They cannot be just one or two paragraphs. They have to be in much more detail to clarify why this particular topic is important in general. And if you are focusing on a particular study setting, why is it important in that particular setting? Followed by this, we start writing about the existing research on the topic or the variables that we intend to study. We focus on what relationships have been studied, what limitations, gaps, and future research directions are prevalent in existing literature. You provide a solid argument as to what is available in the literature. And how do you get this argument? You get it from existing research, the limitations that have been identified in existing research, the gaps that have been identified, the future research directions that have been proposed. You might situate a gap based on your own understanding as well, but that has to be supported by literature as well. For instance, you might not find much research on how servant leadership affects project success. But then you have to mention what research is available on servant leadership and organizational outcomes. And then you mention that to the best of your knowledge and through search in peer-reviewed databases, there is very limited research on how servant leadership affects project success. And if there is any research available on servant leadership in project-based organization or project setting, you actually explain that research. Or in other words, what you can do is, if somebody or some existing research has recommended something that needs to be done in future, you use that reference and put it in your background. But it is important to note that those references should be latest. You situate your problem based on latest references, not on old references. I actually prefer something that is like within 1 year or the past 1 year, 6 months maybe. And followed by this, you mention the theoretical lens for this study. This is again very important. You mention what theory you are going to use to explain the relationship between your variables. You might not have a theory as well. So there are different concepts that might not be studied when, for example, you are explaining the relationship. You might not find a theory. So by theory, we do not actually mean that it has to be theory by the name of the theory. Sometimes there are times when you do not find explicit theories relating different variables. Then obviously you go for literature review or the existing literature that is available, but do not go into much detail in the introduction chapter. All these things explaining why this relationship exists, how this relationship exists, this comes in the literature review. But it is important that you find a theoretical lens if there is one available. Once you have written this background, all these 4 points clarified, maybe 5-6 pages in the introduction chapter on this. Once you are through this, you now know what is the problem in existing research. And then you write about the problem statement. It is a general statement highlighting what issue you want to study in your research. Following your problem statement, you write your research objectives that actually flow from your problem statement. We are going to look into a detailed example as to how to write a problem statement, how to write research objectives based on problem statement. Followed by research objectives are research questions. They are again based on your research objectives and problem statement. So we will have a detailed example on how to write research objectives and research questions based on the problem statement. Then you write your research contribution. This is again very important, something based on the existing research on variable. What existing limitations or what limitations, gaps and future research directions are available in the literature, and based on this you formulate your research questions. For all this we will be looking into different examples as to how they are written. And then you mention in the introduction chapter of your research thesis the significance of your study. How is this study important? Is it important for the individuals within the organization? If so, how? Is it important for the management? If so, how? Any economic significance of this study? So you write about the significance of the study from different perspectives. You write it from in the individual perspective, you write it from the management perspective, and you write it from the organizational and the economic perspective of the country maybe. Following this, you write about the operational definitions, the variables that you have included in your study. You define those variables. The operational definition of those concepts is important. And finally, you write about the proposed structure of your thesis. What's the following chapter? It's literature review. What comes after that? So all those chapters and a brief description of what's included in those chapters. So this is a general overview of what should be included in your introduction chapter of a research thesis. Moving on, how do you start your introduction chapter? We have mentioned that we write about value, importance of the area, topic in general. We have mentioned we talk about the value of the topic in the field of study, or maybe if we are focused on a particular study setting, we write about it. How this particular topic is important in this particular study setting. But still students get confused as to how to start writing. Where shall we start? We've got an independent variable, we've got a dependent variable, we've got mediating variables or moderating variables. Where do we start? Now, in order to answer this question and in order to simplify this issue, I've formulated a few tips. Now, shall we start from the dependent variable? Shall we start from the independent variable or the mediating or moderating variable? The answer for me is quite simple. Focus on the variable around which you have concentrated the study limitations and gaps. So you start from the variable around which you have situated your gaps. Now, for instance, if you are studying from, or if your gaps revolve around your independent variable, then you should start from your independent variable by identifying the value and importance of your independent variable. Now, after that you have identified the value and importance of this particular variable or your independent variable, your focus should be how it relates to the dependent variable. Now, once you have done this, further, if there are any mediating variables in your study, the scholars can focus on identifying that the influence is not entirely direct, that independent variable does not directly influences or it does not have a total impact on the dependent variable, but actually the impact of IV on DV is through other variables referred to as mediating variables. So this is how you can start. And once you have mentioned about the mediating variable, that the influence is not direct, the scholar can state that existing research has identified several gaps pertinent to the relationship of the variables. It should be S. So there are gaps in existing research pertinent to how these variables are interrelated with each other. And then you start writing about your gaps. I've got an example paper here, revisiting the relationship between corporate social responsibility and organizational performance, the mediating role of team outcomes. The full reference will be shared in the description. Now let's have a look at this paper. Or before going into the detail on how to write the paper. Let's look at this thesis. Now, if you look at this thesis, this is from a good university. So if you're writing the introduction chapter, you start with the overview of the chapter. Then different universities, different supervisors might change the format of the introduction chapter. But in general, your introduction chapter must have these 13 points. You start with the overview, you end with the structure of the thesis. And all these things must be in there. So if you look here, all these things are in there. You might propose or you might show your research model in the introduction as well, just to guide the reader as to what you are going to do in detail in your research. Here is another thesis, the same thing, your research problem, and then they have divided the research problem into 3 sub-problems. You can do this as well. If you've got a bigger problem to deal with, you can divide that problem into sub-problems in your thesis. Similarly, you can do this for your research objectives and your research questions as well. So, existing research theses have followed a similar pattern. So, you can go for this pattern as well. Now, going back to our example for writing, when you start writing with your IV, or when you are focusing on the IV in your thesis, or when your gaps revolve around your IV. So how do you do this? Now, here is an example. Here is the paper, revisiting the relationship between corporate social responsibility and organizational performance, the mediating role of team outcomes. Now, since the journal is corporate social responsibility and environmental management, it only fits the reason that we started with corporate social responsibility. Now, we started with the value of corporate social responsibility as to how it's important. And following this, we moved on to the empirical research revealed inconclusive findings regarding the impact of CSR practices on organizational performance. Now, how there are inconclusive findings? This is supported by literature. Now, our mediating variable. They argued, or these authors or scholars have argued, that the direct relationship between CSR and organizational performance cannot assure 100% reliability. And this means that there should be mediating mechanism involved. And through this, and then we further propose as, okay, these are our mediators, and why studying these mediators is important. What are the gaps prevalent to these mediators? Then you start writing about your gaps. So if you are focused on, or if you start writing with your IV, this is how you can do it. Following this, if you're starting with your DV, so after identifying its value and importance, you can start focus on how it is affected by the IV. Sorry for the typing mistake. Further, if there are mediating variables, so when you're starting with your dependent variable, and once you have identified its value, the next step is how it is affected by the independent variable. And then the same story again. If there are mediating variables, the scholar can focus on identifying the influence, that the influence is not entirely direct and that there are mediating variables. And following this, the scholar can state that there are several gaps pertinent to the relationship between the variables. Now, here is an example paper, Servant Leadership and Employee Innovative Behavior Exploring Psychological Pathways. Now, if you look at this paper, here, the authors actually start with the dependent variable. And once they have mentioned the importance of innovation, and if you are writing a thesis, obviously this has to be in much detail. And then, therefore, it is important to understand the antecedents and mechanism influencing employee innovative behavior. Now, in a single line, the authors have mentioned that there is a need to study how different factors influence this variable, and that how different variables can explain the mechanism of impact. And following this, there is a detailed discussion on the gaps pertinent or prevalent, in existing research. So this is how you can start when you are focusing on the dependent variable. Now, what if you are focusing on Let's say if you start around the study setting, you're not starting from the independent variable, you're not starting from the dependent variable. But what if you are starting around the study setting? So gaps may be concentrated around the study setting. They might not be concentrated around knowledge management or the independent variable, or the dependent variable, maybe organizational performance. The gaps may be concentrated around the study setting. For instance, higher education. The scholar may start with how the topic is important for a particular study setting. Now you relate that particular topic, that particular concept, that particular construct to the study setting. And then you identify how there is very limited research on this particular topic in a particular study setting. Now the example paper that I've taken is Knowledge Management Processes, Knowledge Worker Satisfaction and Organizational Performance, Symmetric and Asymmetrical Analysis. Now here is the example paper. I'll share all the references in the description. Now here is the paper, and the start is with higher education institutions require. Now the focus is on study setting, and then how these concepts are related to that particular study setting. And then followed by this, what gaps are prevalent. An assessment of existing literature associated with KM has helped to recognize significant gaps that needs to be filled in the field of higher education institutions. So this is how you can start writing your introduction. Moving on, let's start, or let me give you some examples of the value or how each of these different sections that we have previously identified, how they must be written. What are the examples, or what examples could be followed? Obviously, it is strongly recommended that you read some good papers in your area, because this will give you a more clear knowledge as to how to write. This is very important. In order to write, you should be able to read. So, value of the topic in general. Here is an example. Corporate social responsibility has become a business imperative. According to the Business for Social Responsibility, CSR is operating a business in a manner that meets or exceeds the ethical, legal, commercial, and public expectations that society has of business. Social responsibility is a guiding principle for every decision made and in every area of business. So if this is the first paragraph from this paper. So what does this paragraph do? This highlights the value of corporate social responsibility. So this should be your first paragraph, value of your topic in general. And obviously, if you are focused on a particular setting, then you write about that particular area. For example, research on servant leadership has primarily focused on business organization with relatively little or scarce research in context of higher education institutions. Higher education institutions are faced with increased complexity. Now, here the authors are describing why this particular concept is important in this particular area. And here is the reference for the paper. Moving on. Then once you have identified the value in general and value particular or pertinent to the particular setting, you write about existing research on the variables. What relationships have been studied? What are the gaps? What are the limitations? What are the future research directions that existing scholars have identified that you are taking into account and you are situating your own research? For instance, KM processes in particular, knowledge sharing has captured a greater part of scholarly attention. Now, knowledge sharing has been discussed in much detail relevant to or pertinent to KM processes. The role of EO has been assessed as a predictor of limited number of KM processes such as knowledge utilization, knowledge sharing, and knowledge creation. However, or additionally, EO literature or entrepreneurial orientation literature linkage to knowledge related activities in the organization has attracted much less scholarship. Now, if you look here, all these references are latest. And what you are doing is you are mentioning actually two things. What research is available and what are the limitations of existing research. This is obviously taken from a research paper. In research thesis, you can go in much more detail as to what might be the results of the relationship between existing research. And if there are contradictory relationship. So you can go much more deeper in your research thesis. So here is the source for the paper. Now the limitations, gaps, future research directions based on previous studies. Now again, it is strongly recommended they must be latest. Again, an example, although the interest in EL has been growing, the concept of EL is significantly underdeveloped. The various parts of leadership literature have yet to permeate in the field of entrepreneurship. So, mentioning the limitations of existing research. Now, it's very important to mention here that do not just mention the limitations of existing research. Do not just mention, okay, why, or okay, somebody has mentioned, okay, this variable must be studied. Apart from just mentioning that this particular variable needs attention, you should also mention why this particular variable needs attention. This is very important. And here's the source. Now the theoretical lens. Obviously, if you are explaining relationship between variables, it should be based on certain theory or existing theory that is available. In this case, for this example, we've got the theoretical lens for this study is knowledge-based view by Grant 1996, which argues that organizations are social entities that use and store internal knowledge, competencies, and capabilities. So you define the knowledge-based view, and you may mention that this theory has been used extensively in this type of research or with these variables. You may mention a bit more detail in the thesis or the introduction of a research paper, but further detail as to how this particular theory will help explain the relationship and how it explains the relationship between the variables. This must be done in the detailed literature review, that is section 2 or section B of your research paper or chapter 2 of your research thesis. Now once you are through this, once you mention the theoretical lens, if you're writing a thesis or even if you're writing a research paper, you should clearly identify your problem statement. But if you're writing a thesis, that has to be done under the heading of problem statement. Now problem definition or problem statement, as it is also referred to, is a clear, concise, precise statement of the question or issue that is to be investigated with the goal of finding an answer or solution. So it is a statement. Sometimes obviously you see large paragraphs in problem statement. In that case, the problem statement has, or before you identify your problem statement or you write your problem statement, what you are doing is you are explaining the gaps or limitations in existing research. So that becomes part of your problem statement. But I prefer the other way around. I like writing a clear-cut statement as my problem statement. Now, after reading the literature, after going through the papers, the researcher now can narrow down the problem from the original broad. The question or the problem does not necessarily mean that there is something seriously wrong. It means that there is a gap in the research. It means that there are certain limitations in the research that should be filled. So it's not a problem per se. Now the problem or the question could indicate an interest in an issue, where finding the right answer might help to improve the existing situation or existing literature. So the problem statement is a clear, precise and brief statement of the question to be investigated with the goal of finding an answer or solution. Scientific research starts with the definitive aim or purpose. To find solution for identified problem or problem statement that includes the general objective and research questions of the research shall be developed. So your problem statement or the objectives and research questions are actually part of your problem statement. So these general objectives or objective and research question actually flow from your problem statement. How? We will be looking at an example. So gathering initial information about the factors that are possibly related to the problem will help us narrow down the problem area. Now if you are focusing on, let's say I'm focusing on corporate social responsibility. Now if I go through the literature and I find that there is still existing much debate on how corporate social responsibility influences organizational performance. And existing research also tells me that the scholars have asked for further research into how different variables could explain the mechanism of impact of corporate social responsibility on organizational performance. Now, based on this, and after I've done my literature review, I can write my own problem statement. Now, what's the anatomy of a problem statement? Here is an example of a problem statement. Determine the extent to which career satisfaction mediates the relationship between servant leadership and life satisfaction in higher education institution. Now, this is a very clear, precise, concrete problem statement that actually tells its reader what this study intends to do. Now, let's see what's in the problem statement. To identify the key terms in your problem statement, look at the subjects. Now, what are the subjects in this study? There are 3 subjects: servant leadership, career satisfaction, and life satisfaction. Now, what are the verbs? What actions or what sort of actions you are looking forward to between the subjects? It's impact and mediating. And finally, what is the object? What is the study setting? It's higher education institution. So this is the anatomy of your problem statement. Now, definition of key terms must be precise in order to identify the subject of the research and to gain access to relevant academic literature. Precise definition will allow you to explore the literature. Now, if your problem statement is clearly defined, it's precise, it is clear, then searching the literature is really easy. But if your problem statement is not clear, then obviously searching the literature will be difficult. Now, moving on. This problem statement can be changed, or different research objectives and research question can be derived from this particular statement. Now, my problem statement: determine the extent to which career satisfaction mediates the relationship between servant leadership and life satisfaction. Now, how can I change this into research objectives? So I can have 4 research objectives based on this problem statement. The objectives of the study are: first, to identify the impact of servant leadership on life satisfaction, the relationship between IV and your DV. To investigate the effect of servant leadership on career satisfaction, the relationship between IV and MV, mediating variable. Third, to ascertain the impact of career satisfaction on life satisfaction, the relationship between MV and DV. And finally, the mediating role of career satisfaction on the linkage between servant leadership and life satisfaction. Similarly, you will have 4 research questions. Here, they started with 2 and then you had these verbs. Here, they start with a question form because they are research questions. So, does, is, does, whether, if. So, you can have different words to explain or write your research question. So, this is how a problem statement shapes into research objectives and research questions. Obviously, if you are writing a thesis, all these things must be in there in separate headings. We'll be looking at the differences between the two in a table as well. So, finally, if you are writing your research paper, more or less the final paragraph in the introduction is your research contribution. So, here is an example or a few examples. The study provides several contributions to the previous literature. Then you write first, second, third, fourth. 2 to 3 contributions are good enough. First, given the relative scarcity of available integrative research, this paper responds to the numerous calls from scholars to ascertain the mediating mechanism through which customer perceptions of CSR impact customer loyalty in the hotel industry. Now, in the literature, you would have identified the gaps pertinent to the mediating mechanism based on existing research. But in there, you would have mentioned that existing research has called for further research. Now, in the contribution, you are actually mentioning how those gaps shape into the contribution of your study. So, what are you doing to the existing research? To the best of author knowledge, or to the best of our knowledge, previous empirical studies in the hotel industries have not incorporated the identified mediators. So, you have identified the mediators in the limitation sections. Okay, these are the mediators that have not been studied in the relationship between CSR and loyalty. So, this is how you are contributing towards existing research. So, this study contributes by exploring the factors. This statement was not part of the limitations. Now, this statement or statement like these are part of your contribution section, where you actually mention this is what you are doing, or this is the originality of your research, or this is the value of your research. Additionally, the present study integrates. So what is suggested by the existing research? Here in contribution, you mention what you do to cover or to fill those gaps. And this is the theoretical contribution. Again, very important to be mentioned in the contribution section. So, additionally, the present study integrates 3 theoretical approaches: social identity, stakeholder, and signaling theory. In doing so, what it does is it expands previous studies that have based on the social identity perspective almost exclusively to understand CSR loyalty. So existing research has exclusively used social identity theory, but this research uses other 2 approaches as well. And finally, a contribution related to the sample. This was a multicultural study, and this is the source of the paper. Now, when you are writing a research paper, obviously its introduction differs from the introduction of a research paper, although the ingredients are almost the same. In a research paper, there are no headings. You just write the introduction without any headings, more or less. But when you are writing thesis, it has to be done in particular sections within the chapter. So you start with the value of the topic in general, value of the topic in a particular study setting, existing research, theoretical lens, research contribution, and finally proposed structure of your thesis. Sorry for the typo, it has to be paper. So this is how you write the introduction of your research paper. Now, what are the differences between a research thesis and a research paper? Let me correct this error first, and then we'll go through paper. And it has to be paper. Okay, moving on. So when you are writing a research thesis, all these headings must be in there. But when you are writing research paper, there are no headings. You start with the introduction and then you write about these things. So when you are writing a research thesis, you start with the background, and in the background you write about the value of the topic in the study setting, existing research on the variable, and that culminates into a research statement, a problem statement that is followed or that flows into research objectives and research questions. And followed by this, you write your research contribution, study significance, operational definition, and proposed structure of your thesis. And in the paper, all these things are obviously in the thesis as well, but in the paper, they are not in the form of a heading. I hope this particular video will help you understand the differences in the introduction chapter of a research paper and research thesis, and will better equip you on how to write a good introduction chapter, maybe for a thesis or a paper. Thank you very much.